To understand the Roman Empire, its staggering architectural triumphs, its seemingly endless military campaigns, and its unprecedented global dominion, you must first look past the marble monuments and the marching legions. You must understand that beneath the surface of this legendary civilization operated a relentless, massive, and entirely silent human engine. Following the Punic Wars, the wealth of conquered nations flooded into the Republic, and with it came human capital on an industrial scale. Between 225 BC and the early 1st century, the enslaved population in Roman Italy did not merely grow. It skyrocketed, expanding rapidly from roughly 600,000 to approximately 2 million human beings. This relentless influx fundamentally altered the demographic reality of the Italian peninsula forever. Driven by conquests and trade, the enslaved demographic swelled from 15% to a staggering 35% of the total population, permanently shifting the balance of labor, wealth, and power in the ancient world.
To the state, these millions were completely stripped of their humanity and their autonomy. In the cold, unforgiving eyes of Roman law, they were classified simply as res, mere things. They were property, to be bought, sold, and disposed of, categorized in the legal treatises alongside cattle, plows, and real estate, entirely subject to the absolute authority of their owners.
The hidden economy of the Roman world demands interrogation. It is a shadowy, complex infrastructure, one that forces us to re-examine everything we think we know about the daily mechanics and the moral foundations of Western civilization. We often instinctively imagine Roman slavery through the lens of modern history, picturing only agricultural field hands bound to the soil. But the Roman reality was far more pervasive and incredibly complex, seamlessly intertwining itself into the daily functions of the state and touching every single layer of society. The spectrum of bondage was vast and varied. It encompassed highly educated Greek doctors entrusted with the very lives of senators and elite imperial bureaucrats who carefully managed the finances of the emperor himself, all the way down to the brute laborers perishing in the sweltering heat of the Aretine pottery factories. The empire did not just use slaves, it was fundamentally, organically dependent on them to maintain its global stranglehold. As we delve deep into the shadows of antiquity, we must explore the lives of the intellectual elite forced into servitude, witness the staggering industrial power generated by human exertion, and trace the uniquely Roman yet deeply fraught path from total bondage to eventual citizenship. The Roman economy was, at its absolute core, a kinetic machine, a vast network of logistics and transport that required immense, unrelenting physical force to function across 3 separate continents. In an era entirely devoid of mechanization, the limitations of animal power quickly became apparent in the intricate supply chains of the Mediterranean. While oxen and mules were utilized wherever possible for basic transport, the most demanding, precision-dependent, and labor-intensive tasks ultimately fell to highly organized human teams. Picture the muddy, bustling banks of the Tiber River, or the extensive, winding canal networks of Gaul. Here, deep in the grueling trench of logistical transport, teams of enslaved men could be found straining against the current. They pulled heavy, grain-laden ships and stone-filled barges upstream on foot, bound to the massive vessels by thick hemp ropes. Through grueling physical endurance, they bridged the crucial gap between the rural harvests and the ravenous urban centers. This was the literal sweat of the slave that oiled the massive, grinding gears of Roman trade. Beyond logistics and transport, we find the clearest evidence of this total industrial dependence when we examine the great manufacturing centers of the late Republic and the early Empire. Take, for instance, the famous Aretine pottery. With its distinct red gloss and intricate molded designs, it was the pinnacle of mass-produced ancient ceramics, shipped by the millions to every far-flung corner of the known world, from the damp borders of Britannia to the arid edges of the Sahara. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of surviving pieces from these bustling workshops, many bearing the meticulous stamps of the master mold makers. Yet, when historians closely read the inscriptions, a chilling reality emerges. Incredibly, every single name found stamped onto these intricate molds belongs to a slave.
These were not small, quiet artisan shops. They were sprawling, highly organized factories, often continuously staffed by as many as 50 enslaved workers at a given time. Operating in harsh, stifling conditions, these individuals were entirely responsible for the mass production that defined Roman material culture and aesthetics. The manufacturing sector was merely a reflection of a much larger structural transformation happening out in the countryside. Agriculture, which had long served as the moral and ideological backbone of the Roman identity, underwent a brutal, slave-driven revolution. The shift in land ownership was catastrophic for the working poor. Between the years 80 and 8 BC, as patrician landowners relentlessly consolidated their wealth, as many as 1.5 million small citizen farmers were systematically displaced. Their ancestral plots were swallowed up and replaced by massive, highly optimized slave-run estates known as latifundia.
To manage complex operations of this unprecedented scale, absentee landlords living comfortably in the city relied entirely on a figure known as a villicus. This was a slave steward who functioned not merely as a simple overseer, but as a high-level executive. Managing complex financial accounts, settling internal disputes among the massive labor force, and employing sophisticated agricultural techniques to ensure the farm produced a vast market surplus that reliably fed the volatile, growing urban masses. It is a stark historical truth that without the expertise and forced labor of these slave managers, the entire Roman agricultural system, and, by extension, the very existence of the empire itself, would have collapsed entirely under its own crushing weight.
Unlike more recent models of slavery, the Roman system operated under a vastly different and honestly deeply unsettling paradigm. You see, we often imagine forced labor is strictly physical, right? The breaking of bodies in agricultural estates or those punishing depths of the silver mines. But in Rome, the reality of bondage was far more complex. It actually infiltrated the highest echelons of intellect.
Part 1. The Greek tutor, the delegation of mind. Within this system, the Romans frequently used slaves for tasks that required the highest levels of education. It was a civilization that conquered with the sword, sure, but it managed its culture through its captives.
Think about this ideological paradox, right at the very heart of the empire. The physical masters of the known world found themselves entirely dependent on the enslaved for their own intellectual and cultural refinement.
The Roman elite did not educate their own children. To spend your days teaching the alphabet, basic arithmetic, or the foundational tenets of grammar, well, that was considered a labor of drudgery. It was far beneath the dignity of a patrician citizen.
Instead, they delegated that critical task to a pedagogue. This was a slave who served as a chaperone, an attendant, and a first teacher. From their very first steps, the minds of Rome's future rulers were intimately shaped by the exact people they legally owned.
If a father was wealthy enough, he'd bypass local options entirely and purchase a highly educated Greek slave to serve as a private tutor. Knowledge, in this society, was a literal commodity. It could be bought, sold, evaluated at the auction block, and imported just like any other luxury good. These individuals were tasked with teaching the fundamentals of Greek literature and philosophy, the very bedrock of Roman elite culture. Their mastery of rhetoric, their appreciation of epic poetry, their adoption of philosophical stoicism, all of it was transmitted directly through the mouths of captives.
And the scale of this intellectual commodification was absolutely staggering. The philosopher Seneca actually records one owner who had 11 slaves specifically taught to recite the works of Homer and Hesiod by heart. They were essentially living, breathing bookshelves, purchased solely to display their master's exorbitant wealth.
Part 2. The medical dependency, healing the household. Now, this intellectual dependence extended far beyond the classroom. It reached directly into the field of medicine, and quite literally, matters of life and death.
Most of the early doctors in the Roman world were Greeks, and for a long time, the majority of these physicians remained slaves. The Roman elite literally placed their physical survival, their health, and their deepest physical vulnerabilities in the hands of the very people they kept in chains.
The medical infrastructure itself was deeply stratified. Wealthy families maintained their own private slave doctors to heal the household, making sure a physician was always on call. Others were apprenticed under master physicians, navigating a highly complex medical hierarchy before eventually earning their freedom through years of dedicated service.
Part 3. The bureaucratic machine. Civil service. If we move beyond the private villas and elite households, the scale of this reliance becomes even more profound. The Roman state itself, that sprawling administrative apparatus of the empire, would have completely ground to a halt without its civil service slaves. They worked as the accountants managing the empire's vast wealth, the architects designing its monumental infrastructure, and even the lictors. Those were the bodyguards and civil servants who carried the fasces and projected the magistrates' actual political power. By the late empire, the inner workings of government were almost entirely captive. Imperial eunuchs, who were all technically imported slaves, held such immense administrative power that they controlled all access to the emperor himself. They acted as the ultimate gatekeepers to the throne.
Operating right from the shadows of the imperial palace, these enslaved bureaucrats were essentially steering the policy of the world's greatest superpower.
The very physical survival of Rome as a metropolis relied completely on this enslaved workforce, from maintaining the massive 700-man Cura Aqua Arm, that's the elite engineering corps that kept the vital aqueducts flowing and the whole city hydrated,
To staffing the professional fire brigades that patrolled the dense neighborhoods, protecting the fragile city from constant ruin and catastrophic infernos.
Behind the marble facades, the Senate decrees, and all those triumphant military conquests lay a stark, undeniable reality. The state was a machine, built entirely of human labor.
When we think of ancient Rome, it's so easy to just picture the Colosseum, right? The gladiators fighting, or maybe those emperors draped in purple walking through grand marble palaces. But, well, beneath all that polished marble and the roaring crowds, there's a completely different truth. There was this massive, hidden economy that literally fueled the entire empire from the ground up. So today, we're stepping back in time to uncover a deeply calculated, intricately designed system. We're looking at the silent foundation of Rome's total reliance on enslaved labor. And it's a fascinating story because it all centers on this incredible illusion of benevolence, a system so carefully crafted that it kept a whole civilization running for centuries, all while masquerading as an engine of opportunity.
Which brings us to a huge question. What actually kept millions of Roman slaves from just rebelling? I mean, when your society has a vast population held in chains, uprisings become a constant, terrifying, existential threat to the ruling class. The logistics of suppressing human nature on that massive of a scale, it's absolutely staggering. Now, sure, the Roman legions were formidable. You had the disciplined ranks, the sharp steel, the threat of violence was definitely omnipresent. But here's the thing. The real secret to Rome's incredible long-term stability wasn't just the sword. It was this deeply psychological architecture of control. The Roman elite built a highly effective social mechanism that literally weaponized ambition. They conquered the mind by carefully managing the one thing that's actually more powerful than fear: hope.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the answer really lies in a concept called the peculium. By strict Roman law, an enslaved person was considered property, so technically anything they held belonged entirely to their master. But the reality on the ground was way more calculated. Roman culture actually widely respected this idea of the peculium. Masters systematically allowed enslaved individuals to hold property, to accumulate their own personal wealth, and to keep their savings securely tucked away in little wooden boxes over years and years. On the surface, it masquerades as this really progressive act, right? Allowing a human being to keep the fruits of their own labor. But make no mistake, this wasn't an act of pure kindness. It was a brilliantly calibrated move to incentivize relentless hard work and just completely pacify their spirit.
So this slow accumulation of wealth forged a very clear, culturally recognized path to freedom, and it worked in specific sequential steps. First, obviously, came the diligent saving of the peculium. We're talking years of labor, intense discipline, and quiet sacrifice. But then, the second step, and this reveals a totally wild psychological paradox in the Roman mindset, an enslaved person could actually use their hard-earned peculium to purchase other slaves. Yeah, by becoming a master themselves, they could increase their own productivity and accelerate their savings within the very system that bound them. And then finally, the ultimate transaction, they could hand all that carefully gathered wealth directly to their master to buy their own liberty, earning the right to finally wear the revered Roman cap of liberty. Now, this economic engine relentlessly operated on a dual reality.
On one hand, for the enslaved individual, this path provided genuine, tangible hope. It gave them a real, life-altering reason to wake up, to work incredibly hard to save every penny, and, this is the crucial part, for the empire, to endure their chains without violent resistance. But if we flip it and look at it from the Roman elite's perspective, this was a totally different mechanism. Manumission, the act of actually freeing a slave, was basically never about morality or human rights. For the masters, it was just a cold, vital, and calculated mechanism for total compliance. By dangling this meticulously controlled sliver of achievable freedom, they ensured unwavering loyalty. They effectively neutralized the exact kind of despair that fuels massive uprisings and tears empires apart from the inside out. Often, this highly coveted freedom was actually granted posthumously through something called a testamento. Basically, it was a legal provision written right into a master's will. Just picture this for a second. You're standing on the streets of Rome during a grand, solemn funeral procession. The air is heavy with incense, people are mourning, but walking proudly right beside the deceased master's body are their newly freed slaves, wearing that cap of liberty for the whole city to see. You see, it wasn't some quiet, private legal transaction done behind closed doors. It was a massive public spectacle, a carefully orchestrated display of power, benevolence, and wealth that was designed to be seen, remembered, and gossiped about by absolutely everyone in the forum.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it connects to the mechanics of Roman shame culture. Freeing slaves in a final will and testament was seen as the ultimate, calculated act of aristocratic generosity. It pretty much guaranteed that the deceased left behind this secure, widely recognized legacy of benevolence. Their name would literally be praised in the streets long after they were gone. But actually, this was an investment that paid huge dividends far beyond the grave. It created a fiercely loyal base of freedmen, who were known as clients, who were legally and culturally bound by a deep sense of obligation. These newly freed individuals were expected to fiercely support the master's surviving family, voting for their political interests and boosting their social status for generations to come. When you really zoom out, it becomes so clear. Slaves were the absolute fuel that kept Rome running. Literally from the intimate microcosm of a rich household right up to the sprawling macrocosm of the entire state apparatus. We often think of the Roman Empire as just a political entity, right? Marching legions mapping out frontiers, or eloquent senators debating philosophy in marble halls. But it was actually this vast, entirely slave-dependent experiment. Every single aspect of daily Roman life, every quiet comfort the citizens enjoyed, every towering architectural achievement that's still standing today, all of it, relied completely on this carefully controlled, endlessly toiling, and, as we've seen, cleverly manipulated workforce. The empire was built on their backs and sustained by their carefully managed hopes. And his hidden workforce? They definitely weren't just confined to anonymous, unskilled labor out on some distant agricultural estate. Their contributions were incredibly sophisticated, diverse, and absolutely foundational to the empire's survival. I mean, we're talking about the ship towers who ensured that the complex logistics of Mediterranean trade just kept flowing. They were the highly skilled potters and artisans running massive manufacturing sectors and producing everyday goods. They were the elite doctors managing public health. They were the brilliant architects engineering the aqueducts, and the educated tutors shaping the minds of the next generation of Roman citizens. They were the invisible muscle, the hidden intellect, and the silent lifeblood maintaining absolute imperial control over the known world. So, looking back at all of this, we have to ask, what is the true cost of Roman stability? All that magnificent architecture, the prolonged eras of peace, the profound cultural and legal advancements that shaped the Western world, they were all entirely subsidized by a deeply calculated, emotionally manipulative system of human subjugation. Acknowledging that reality really forces us to look closer at the hidden labor behind all great historical empires and, to question the true foundations of civilization itself. Thank you so much for joining us on Vantage for this explainer. Be sure to subscribe because we're going to be exploring the final days of Rome in our upcoming episode.